Hello, everyone. Happy New Year, and welcome to the first Global Lecture of 2022. My name is Chris Lubkeman. I am the head of strategic foresight at ETH in Zurich and your host for today's dialogue. We have a great conversation ahead of us. The title is The New Middle Ages, the New Medieval, or the Middle Ages again? We've been there once, we're seeing it again. The ETH Global Lecture Series offers a platform for contemporary global topics to be discussed with outstanding global thinkers. Each month, we bring together two amazing people to discuss their personal insights, experiences, expertise, and wisdom. In addition to simply learning, our goals are to broaden our perspectives of contemporary topics so we can all broaden our thinking, challenge our opinions, preconceived notions of normal, and through this, make an increasingly meaningful contribution to the issues which all of us are working on every day. I am really, truly happy to be here in our studio and honored to be able to host today's conversation with two wonderful individuals. You might already know them from last year's lecture entitled How to Better Prepare for Tomorrow, when we spoke about connectivity, confluence, and rainy day funds. So first, I'd like to introduce to you our international guest, Parag Khanna, a leading global strategy advisor, world traveler, best-selling author, incredibly intriguing human. He is the founder and managing partner of FutureMap, a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm. And Parag's newest book is entitled Move, The Forces Uprooting Us, which just came out this past year. So welcome, Parag.
Thank you so much. Happy New Year. Great to see you again.
Great to have you here. And I believe you're coming to us from Singapore right now. Is that correct?
I am for today.
All right. That's right. We're never quite sure where you are in the world, but it's great that you're here with us today. And COVID conform, here as we would say. His ETH discussion partner is once again the fantastic Myriam Dunn Cavelty. She is a senior lecturer for security studies and deputy for research and teaching at our Center for Security Studies. Her research focuses on the politics of risk and uncertainty in security politics and changing conceptions of international security due to cyber issues, including cybersecurity, cyber war, protection of critical infrastructure, and other aspects which she can't tell me about. I'm sure we're going to have, as we did last year, an incredible conversation. So welcome, Myriam.
Thank you.
Great to have you here in the studio. And also Corona conform.
Yes.
So our conversation today will be 60 minutes. I will begin the dialogue with our two guests, and you, our audience, will have the possibility to ask questions pretty much at any time by entering them into the link. I will incorporate them during our conversation and try to get to each and every one of them if I can. And if not, I apologize in ahead of time, but I will do my very best to integrate them. So, are we ready?
Yes.
Parag, you ready?
Absolutely.
So the first question for both of you, and I'm going to start with Parag as our guest. You just came out with a book, Move. Can you tell us a little bit about what's the premise of the book? What's the book about?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me join you again. This is the second conversation we're having during this pandemic. So if being in lockdown equates to gaining wisdom, then I suppose that would be the only merit by which I'm qualified to share this esteemed stage with both of you again. So lovely to see you, Chris and Myriam. Looking forward to this discussion. And yes, since we last spoke, Move was released. It was actually delayed because of COVID. Mm-hmm. So it had been written before COVID, and it had to be COVIDified, as I like to say, updated. And I found that process, quite frankly, not as difficult as I would have thought, which is ironic, because if the book is titled Move, and it was published during the most universal and strictly enforced global lockdown in human history, surely people would be dubious about the thesis. But instead, it was published But in the grand sweep of history, if we think about the constant shifts in human geography, which is fundamentally what the subject of the book is our human geography, the distribution of people around the world, our demographic composition, even looking at ethnological issues as well, all of that is human geography. And given that that story has an arc that's more than 100,000 years long, quite frankly, the pandemic does appear more as something of a blip. Whereas the underlying forces that I examine in the story are far more durable, long-lasting, and most relevant for today, accelerating. And those include things like the demographic imbalances, the labor imbalances, the gap between old and young in the world that is not only severe within countries, as we know all too well from the OECD world, Western Europe, North America, and Japan, but also across countries, because we have this significant mismatch between the geography of old people and young people. Secondly, there is the political crises and upheavals, whether it is international conflicts, civil wars, and the refugee flows that emerge from them, and the dislocation of people as a result of political violence generally. It could be Afghanistan, Syria, Venezuela, you name it. So that too is a process that continues unabated and more or less intense in different parts of the world. Then there is, of course, economic dislocation, which is, again, a perpetual story. Think about, in general, people searching for a greater opportunity, or in particular, the rise of outsourcing and the ways in which it's displaced labor and forced people to look for new work, different sectors, and more affordable locations. But then there's also the technological disruptions that go along with it. We have labor automation, which has similar effects in displacing workers and forcing physical relocation. But then the digital dimension of course, the internet and Zoom and work from home and all of those kinds of things, in which now people can voluntarily relocate themselves while still maintaining their professional lives. And finally, there's climate change, which is actually the original driver, you might say, of our human geography, with most of the human population located between 20 degrees and 30 degrees north latitude. Now, that's not an accident, right? Of course, it's due to climate change and natural resources. Now, we can deep dive over the course of the conversation or at any point into each of these 5 pillars, but suffice it to say that, again, every one of them actually is at a level of sort of acuteness and acceleration that is actually unprecedented. So the notion that we would be permanently locked down just because we happen to be locked down is obviously a farce. Sure. So I wanted to take this opportunity to forecast the future of human geography in light of these 5 major baskets of drivers and disruptions, and to paint a new map for where humanity will be located over the next 10, 20, 30 years, with a particular focus on young people, because I'm sure you will both agree, if you want to forecast the future of human demographics, you need to be looking at young people. And so I'll just conclude by saying that one of the methodological joys, of investigative joys of doing this book was interviewing a lot of young people, not just talking to, prime ministers and defense ministers and mayors and CEOs. I actually had focus groups put together. And, as someone who travels a lot, I'm always talking to the fixers and the kids on the street and the students anyway. But this time I made them the protagonists. And the protagonists of this entire book are the 4 billion young people of the world who are age 35 and under. So it was really eye-opening, refreshing, somewhat alarming, of course, to hear directly from those young people who are voting with their feet to shape the future of human geography. And I tell their stories as much as possible in this book as well.
Thank you very much, Parag. Fascinating. I love those 5, and especially as you just said with the how was it, 4 billion? How many
4
billion?
billion, yeah.
44.
4 billion young people. More than half the world's population actually is still young.
4 billion, and unfortunately, I'm not one of them. So there we go. But as you say, voting with their feet, which has to do with the movement. And we're going to come back to these when we think about the medieval, the impact it has on this idea of the medieval and where that might be heading. So Myriam, what are you working on right now?
Actually, I also released a book, I just realized.
Did
but it's
you?
only an edited volume, so it doesn't count as much.
Oh, yeah, that's still wonderful.
Yes, absolutely. It's an open access book that
Yep.
also has a lot to do with the topic today, I think. You know, the sharing of knowledge and the
Yep.
availability that it has worldwide. It's on cybersecurity politics, which is my overall topic, and I'm working on another book on cybersecurity politics. There, the idea really is to bring the technical together with the social and the political, and to make sure that we don't fall into those traps of seeing technology as a driver in society. It is a driver, but it's not one that is not also driven by decisions that human beings make and that young people make, how to use technologies in their lives, and also the demands that we have towards technologies that also shape the market in the end. So that is, something, I'm a political scientist, that is still missing, and a good integration of technological forces with the human, and also the future, how we shape technological futures, sometimes without realizing, but sometimes very, openly and willfully.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So thank you for that. So you both liked the title, which we came up with.
The Middle Ages, you mean? Yes,
The
absolutely.
Middle Ages. Why?
I actually studied history first.
Okay.
Yes.
Yep.
And one of the things I did was study medieval history.
No, come on. Okay.
I've always
All right.
been very fascinated by the church, history of the church, actually. But the relationship to what I'm doing now is obviously it's a history of power. It's about power. And it's about, different parts of societies interacting in different ways, pushing against power, using power, etc. So it is political history.
Yeah.
So that's where my fascination for this
That's
period
great.
comes
So
from.
really, as you're saying, power, and that's probably why politics is interesting
Yes.
for you too. Yeah.
Yes.
So Parag, why is this? Why did you find a resonance with this title?
Well, about 15 or 20 years ago, one of the great military historians, Martin van Creveld of Israel, started using this term Neomedievalism. And I was just a young student then, and I really became, seduced by the notion. And I started thinking about the parallels between the medieval world, which of course, spans anywhere from 1,000 years to a shorter period, but had very different characteristics in different regions of the world. The world was very much a regional patchwork. In some parts of the world, such as Europe, we identify it partially as being the Dark Ages, but in other parts of the world, it was the Golden Ages. And of course, it was a period of history that was genuinely multi-civilizational and multipolar. Chinese and Indian dynasties were powerful at the time, while Europe was actually weak. I mean, the New World had not yet really been, quote unquote, discovered. But nonetheless, it was very much a distributed system. And I've, over the last couple of decades, built upon this theme of neo-medievalism quite a lot in different writings. And in this book in particular, I construct 4 scenarios about the future. One is called regional fortresses, which is to some degree a continuation of the present.
Yep.
Another is called the New Middle Ages. And I look at the ways in which there is going to be a more localized patterns of attempts at self-sufficiency, at different regional structures of international politics, whether it is hierarchies or whether it is multi-layered competition between supranational organizations, national governments, provincial level structures, cities, and of course, horizontal competition as well among firms, civil society actors, religious actors, and so forth. So that deep complexity in the structure of political order is a characteristic of the Middle Ages that is, a very likely scenario for our future in many parts of the world. There's other scenarios that are downright medieval as well. One that I call the barbarians at the gate. And then there's a 4th scenario called Northern Lights. But in many ways, because the future is unknowable,
Sure.
I craft these 4 hypotheses about it. And the New Middle Ages strikes me for much of the world as the most likely one. So naturally, then I'm very pleased that we've agreed upon that. as something of a leitmotif for this conversation.
So let me ask you as well, so you believe this is the most likely scenario, Parag? Myriam, what about you?
I think I do agree. Now, what I also thought about when we discussed the Middle Ages is where are we coming from? Because part of the Middle Ages, there was the fall of the Roman Empire and then it took away and then, we were in the Middle Ages. What is that image we have of what is before? And now that we started the discussion, I'm suddenly not sure whether we all know why we believe we're going into a darker period or whether that is really necessarily bad. Because whenever, all those terms are obviously loaded with value judgments and geography, as we heard, etc. And I think what's super important here is to actually keep maybe a global view. Because, when you look from Europe, it's just completely different than when you look at it from Asia or when you really look at the world as a whole. And I think that is super important before we do value judgments and try to think about what is good and bad in this world.
So I think we consciously didn't say the Dark Ages.
Yes.
Right. I think we're gonna put the Dark Ages over to the side and stick it in one of these books and just leave it sit there because, as Parag always said, and I'm sure much more. I didn't study history. I was a science geek. But the Aztecs, the Mayans in the Americas were flourishing. We had the native cultures who were flourishing, the Aboriginals flourishing. So there were many civilizations, high and natural, that already existed and coexisted, which is just patchwork. I think we could say maybe the American or Northwestern-led say rationalization of commerce, sort of similar to the Roman roads, kind of rationalizing commerce, and I think we're feeling this slowly crumbling, and perhaps might be why. But the question is that a valid comparator or not?
Which one you mean?
With the American-led commercial highways, or the capitalism, Western-led capitalism, or is this just my naive belief? Parag, what do you think?
Well, actually, I'm glad you raised this because there was, for much of the known world, which does indeed actually exclude the great civilizations of Central America that you cited earlier, but for what is known as Afroeurasia, the pre-colonial world, which overlaps with the medieval period, was a thriving set of overlapping commercial zones. And so historians, sociologists of that era, of the pre-colonial world, of the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, those that look at either Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo, or the early maritime explorations of the Portuguese and Spanish, use this term Afro-Eurasia. And it obviously symbolizes the growing connectivity of cultural exploration, of maritime commerce between Africa, Europe, and Asia that was nascent and forming in these various circuits of trade at the time. And what is so striking is to look exactly at how that Afro-Eurasian system, meta system, is already being so reconstituted, so strongly reconstituted today. Some would call it Belt and Road, or the Eurasian integration and the greater Indian Ocean. But these geographies and initiatives have really, really lifted off since the end of the Cold War. So in exactly 30 years, the last 30 years have witnessed an absolutely staggering rise in Afro-Eurasian interactions that are importantly not colonial, that are not necessarily hierarchical in the ways that the colonial system that came afterwards were. And in that sense, there is a very useful structural comparison between that Afro-Eurasian system of the medieval world temporally and what we're in the early stages of rebuilding today.
So I want to thank you for that, Parag. So I want to pull this up into a slightly perhaps different position, but we're thinking about this patchwork when it comes to the internet, when it comes to cybersecurity, which is more your domain. There's also talk about the splinternet, this idea of the medieval, this fracturing. But how does this world, in which you have your fingers in and your head in, compare and overlay with what Parag was just describing?
I think there's many overlays. The geographies don't always match, and that's also something you look at in your book. There's different geographies, but there are geographies in the cyberspace as well. Some of them are national. So you see how nation states, because they feel threatened by certain of these movements, try to re-establish power. So we're back to power. And power has a lot to do with the ability to have borders and control borders, has always, and also control territories, which, if you go back to the Middle Ages, is exactly the same what happened there. So, you know, the states only developed through this ability to control a territory and, you know, people that would pay taxes, for example. So I think what we're seeing in cyberspace is in some ways, and I'm not sure whether it's more of a middle-age kind of thing or where we're actually also going, you know, towards the state again that is retaking power, at least in the world that I look at, which is more the strategic, security, political. Many states are back with a vengeance, trying to actually re-establish their old ways of governing. And that creates those clashes that we are feeling, where you have, you know, a geography that does not match, that actually tries to get out of this, but, you know, strong arming of old institutions. I think we're seeing it with, you know, the whole Bitcoin debates, where a lot of state institutions now realize maybe we should try and control this sphere. And that is normal. I think that always happens when technologies, you know, arrive, new ideas. So there's almost like a back and forth between different forces until there's some kind of legitimate way of dealing with it.
And the equilibrium is found, or the appropriate application is found, the innovation hype and cycle. So I want to come back to what you just mentioned, which I find really intriguing, which is this regaining control. Because Parag, and your premise with Move, what's the role of power as you see this? Because you're quite clear about this as a sort of resurgence of the structure of power. Are you advocating as to saying it's going to be free, or tell me, what do you think?
Well, now this is where we really have to emphasize the regional dimension. Things are quite different across different parts of the world. Now, one thing though that is interesting is the ways in which, and this is very lockdown specific, but it was so fascinating to see the return of borders during lockdown follow certain patterns of affinity. You know, Schengen, you know, threatened to be broken down, but certain pairs of states or provinces remained open to each other because of their historically strong relations. You know, within the United States, you may remember, Chris, hearing about this, you know, in New York, even in the Hamptons, which is part of New York, they wanted to stop people with New York City license plates because there was a sense that they were actually going to be bulk buying all the groceries from their shops. Hawaii, which is of course one of the 50 states, but an island, sought to block flights coming in from the US for fear of having too many infected Americans coming within America, whereas they were trying to stay open to Japanese, who at the time had COVID better under control. So I call this the new Hanseatic League. And of course, the Hanseatic League was a quintessentially medieval alliance of trade and to some degree also military partners. But beyond those sort of, again, short-term, you know, superficial comparisons, I do think the question of power varies very much region to region. And it isn't necessarily medieval or not medieval, right? You know, I mean, of course, in Europe, everyone is familiar with the notion that the supranational European Union, has various resemblances to either the Holy Roman Empire or the Habsburg Empire and dynasties and so forth, and those take us across multiple periods, and it has nothing to do with COVID, and we wouldn't have to have that conversation today in 2022. We could be having the conversation 7 or 8 years ago. And that's a very different landscape than the structure of power in North America versus in Asia. In Asia, there's a school of thought that there is a return to the tributary system that characterized the, again, temporally medieval period in which various Chinese dynasties, particularly the Ming dynasty, exhibited significant hierarchical kinds of control over so-called tributary states comprising much of East Asia and Southeast Asia. But quite frankly, I don't believe in that school of thought. I believe that actually Asia rather, is coming to become much more of a modern, multipolar kind of system that is, does not have an analogy in Asian history per se, certainly not a medieval one. So I would say that, we should at this point not generalize too much about the globe, which is itself, again, the most medieval thing you can say, because there wasn't a global system then. And what I think the inflection point that we might be at today is that even though we feel that we live in one world and we have one climate and one economy and things like COVID spread so quickly around the world, if we stop and genuinely ask ourselves what issues are being globally governed, in what ways can we genuinely say that there is not just a de facto intensity of global interactions, but actually a global governance, I think we would say that it's still rather weak and that regional dynamics are actually more powerful. And that, again, is a very much a medieval fact.
Yeah. Do you have any comment to that?
Yeah, I think what I find important here is really the worldview that somebody in the Middle Ages had versus the worldview we have. So I don't think it's possible to actually return to a world where we don't know about the world out there. But, for somebody living in the Middle Ages, that was reality. You knew about the local, maybe if you were somewhere in the rich classes, a bit beyond that. But large parts of the world were simply not there. And I think that is something that is both a threat nowadays, but obviously a huge opportunity, that we have the ability to think about the global, that we have the ability to think about global governance, about issues that we think need to be governed globally because they're really global concerns. Whereas we can differentiate. We can say this is so important, like the climate, has to be governed at a global level. So we need to make sure that happens. Whereas other things, and I would fully agree, are very local or regional.
That's really fascinating, because as Parag was just mentioning with these circles, that perhaps during that time, in the medieval time, the only people who truly understood what was going on all around the world was the commercial class.
Yeah.
You're saying the Hanseatic League, or those who were really...
That were mobile.
Who were those who were moving.
Yes,
exactly.
Yes, yeah.
And those... But it was also... Here's the question then. The relationship between survival and thrival, and how we see this moving forward over the next, say, decade. Because survival is an increasing number of humans on the planet are just, again, trying to survive versus thriving.
Yeah.
And in the medieval days, I'm sure there were more people who were just trying to survive. There's a very tiny class who could thrive. So if we look forward with that survival versus thrival, where do we see this heading? Parag?
Sure. Well, that goes back to these scenarios. And again, so we cannot speak confidently about which direction the whole world will take. In fact, we can see elements of a fortress world, a medieval world, a Northern Lights world of enlightened thinking about a utilitarian calculus within regions and even internationally. We can see each of those signals just about everywhere. You can see very high migration into Canada at the same time that Donald Trump was president, right? Canada decided that it was going to have the world's most generous immigration policy even before Trump was elected. and sustained that all the way through Trump and COVID into the present. But there's also the regional fortresses and the new Middle Ages, the barbarians at the gate. You can see that in Europe. Look at the Mediterranean Sea, which is very often tragically likened to a graveyard for so many of those that are trying to make their way across from Africa. And look at the refugee crises in the Near East and other parts of the world. So in each region, we see those that are just struggling to survive, and those that are thriving in that they either live in or are able to construct or purchase the kind of ecosystem that will allow them to continue to thrive. So I live in Singapore, which is on the equator, which is technically a region, a geography highly vulnerable to rising sea levels. However, as a wealthy country with universal air conditioning and the capacity to raise roads and build sea walls and so forth, there is a sense that here there will be stability and adaptation rather than mass exodus. It's a place that is more likely to have too much water than too little water. Whereas there are many parts in the world that suffer the far worse fate, which is too little water. There's nothing worse than having too little water, right? Too much water is a better problem, quote unquote. To have the Rhine flooding is better, quote unquote, is again less disastrous than to be in a situation like South Sudan or Yemen or other countries that are stricken permanently by drought. And those populations really do have to relocate. So I foresee, again, different population clusters having to either entrench themselves where they are and invest more of their resources into self-sufficiency, such as we're seeing with plant-based food or hydroponic agriculture or solar and renewable power and all of these kinds of things. Whereas other geographies will literally become what I call vacant states. And that's a term that I had not yet encountered in my work, and I had to kind of really start to probe about the geographies of the world that are literally uninhabitable and becoming uninhabitable such that they no longer pass the test, the sort of the fundamental test of being considered states, which is to say a clearly defined and recognized territory and a permanently settled population. What happens when we actually have vacant states? And this is all part of the broader, analysis of geography that I've been assembling, because I believe that as borders change all the time and populations are very much in flux, we of course should not be viewing the world through the prism of the very static political maps that tend to dominate our view. Instead, we should be thinking about the world in a more sociological way in terms of the division of labor. What role do certain places, cities, countries, geographies, resource endowments, and groups of people play in a regional or global system? That's the real operative question day to day, not so much, are you in this country or that country? And looking at the world in that way helps to account for the significant internal disparities that we all know exist within countries and that are so often papered over on the map.
Yeah.
Surviving, thriving. I'm still thinking about that. I think those are very important forces for a variety of reasons. Now, first of all, it's also about the haves and the have-nots and inequality. And I think that is one of our biggest problems now and going forward for a variety of reasons. Climate, access to resources, access to education, I think is also another very important aspect. And the haves feel threatened by the have-nots because, that's where this negative aspect of migration comes from, or where you think somebody comes and wants to plunder us, going back to the, idea of Middle Ages and people coming and taking away what you have. this is very much, at least in Europe, where we're at. It's it's an idea of the threat. Somebody wants to take what we have. I think it goes beyond that. If we look at more of the social unrest around political correctness, you know, racism, all these kind of things, it's very similar. You have people that have a lot, and now they feel threatened by new ideas of equality, you know, that you shouldn't discriminate again, etc. And that will take a while until we get to a new equilibrium.
Yeah.
And I think the new generation, or the young, and maybe the, you know, the really young, the ones that are 10, 20 years old, will play a huge role in this, in actually pushing new values onto the older generations, forcing them to change.
Yeah.
Because what really has to change for the world to be a livable place is inequality, and also, you know, the way we just take without actually making sure that we have enough and that everybody has enough.
Absolutely, especially when we think about that, mixing that with what Parag, what you just said about the global system. Because I'm quite intrigued, because on one hand, if we're talking around a thesis of moving into a medieval age in which there is power protectionism, in which we have these various hyper-regionalization, one could argue then that the global system has broken down. And yet, what you both have said, we're still on the same globe. We're still in a system, it's just a different system, a different power distribution, and a reconsideration of what it means to have and to have not.
And also what is sufficient. How much do you need to have to live a good life? I think this is also in the debate nowadays. Do we need as much as we have? Probably not. And I think that is really interesting that, you know, COVID, the lockdown, forcing people to be in one place has changed some of, you know, the mindsets in that regard, to realize that, you know, maybe we can start discussing how much growth we need in the future, etc., or what values we actually, you know, give value to.
Absolutely, yeah.
This is very interesting, because I think you both now touched on this new values and debates about metrics of progress. And Myriam just mentioned growth, and how much growth. And I would urge everyone to do a comparison of the Sustainable Development Index, which is developed by, you know, a collaboration of various organizations that looks at countries by their, you know, commitments to reducing carbon emissions, but it doesn't capture the externalities of their supply chains through trade and investment. And so actually Scandinavian countries that we tend to think of as being the, you know, highest performers and most sustainable countries, or they actually rank they rank very high in this index. But then look at an index that is called the Sustainable Prosperity Index, SPI. And what that does is to look at the amount of the resources, goods and services consumed per capita in a country that are produced within a more you know, narrow or proximity. So in other words, more self-sufficient places where people also have a high standard of living. And the countries that rank very high in the SPI are not the ones that you see at the top of the SDI. It's countries like Albania and Costa Rica and Sri Lanka and Georgia and so forth, where you have, you know, elevated, you know, standard of living, middle income countries, if you will, that do not have as high an environmental footprint, either domestically or through their trade and supply chains. And the comparison between these two is one anecdote that speaks to the point that Myriam was making, that we actually need to have, because we, as Chris, as you said, we are in a global system, and it is important to factor in our connectivity to others and quantify that connectivity and the resources consumed in that connectivity. And the fact that we even have these very, very different results from different indices and bodies of research points to changes that are happening in our priorities and values. And I think that's a very healthy sign.
It's a great thing that we're actually talking about it, not just here together, the three of us, but it seems like many are talking about it, especially as you indicated, Myriam, when we talk to our 20-year-olds or teenagers or 30-year-olds, or young of heart and young of mind, it's also really becoming a dialogue which is increasing probably everywhere, not just those at the top of the Maslow's pyramid, but also in the middle as well. I want to ask a slightly different question, and it is, excuse me, during the medieval time, there was also a vast differentiation between holding groups intentionally ignorant. There was an educated group, an educated class. There was uneducated groups. This is probably much globally. There were then the guilds in which you were trained, and there was a conscious segregation to you're part of the club, you learn these things or not. But how do we see this in a globalized educational market with the internet, access to YouTube videos where you can learn just about anything? What do we see with this intentional ignorance versus the intentionally educated? What role is this going to be playing as we look forward? Who wants to bite? Go, Myriam.
So you said club, and I'm very glad you used that word, because you can say guild, etc., but we live in clubs. Sometimes we might not realize that we have a membership to a particular club. It's about, access to education. Now, people that are well educated for whatever reason, because they have access, they have parents that make sure that they get a good education, they have a lot of opportunities going forward, and that will stay the same. But I think we do have a counter tendency, which is both sometimes coming from authoritative regimes that actually have this idea of a space, an information space, where they actually want to, have a certain truth that they project, which has a lot to do with, the ability of people to get certain informations and or not get it. And it also has to do with education, because you actually want to steer education in a very particular way. That certain things are just simply not taught in certain areas of the world, or certain things cannot be said.
Yeah.
And then you have political forces that actually, use that for their own goals, because this is exactly the world they strive on. So I think it is a combination of political will, not everywhere, again, we have to be very careful where, but that you have that a lot of politically minded people have realized how valuable education and information is, and that in this resurgence of taking power back, that is one battlefield that I think we see right now.
Yeah.
And access to open education and open thinking, etc. I'm not sure it's all great in that regard going forward.
Concerning. Parag?
Well, in a way, you're suggesting how long will this period last, and what comes next, and what can we do today to sort of short circuit entropy, and a descent into chaos. And I think that the technologies that are available today, that of course technologies of connectivity, technologies of learning and education, this is one of the areas of most rapid progress in the last 10 years. And it's really, there's a lag between the availability of information and knowledge and the empowerment that it brings to populations, and the change in institutions to accommodate people with that knowledge and those skills. And I think that we're in this process of transition there, but it's generally a positive one, in that if we can couple the knowledge and skills that so many people have and are able to acquire with a shift in public policy and economic models to compensate people for their labor, for their efforts, for their time, not purely based upon the very lagging characteristics, of capitalism, and particularly financial capitalism, but shape and steer through policy, then I think that we would have a new renaissance, significantly earlier than the very dire prognosis that many of us would have today.
Fair point. So I'm going to change again, and this time we talked about in the medieval how there were many fluid boundaries, and Parag, you've mentioned it a couple times, and about the like the conquering of territory. And now we've become accustomed to a nation state, which is a fairly modern, if you will, neoliberal, whatever, constitution. And we're seeing in some parts of the world a resurgence in an interest in stronger leadership, more rule of law, or whatever we want to call this, and a resurgence of the nation state, as you just indicated, Myriam, exerting its presence. So is this something we're going to see more of? Do you believe this nationalism and a nation state, or is it going to wax and wane through the fluidity of borders and, as you call, the movement of humans? How do you think?
A European perspective,
Yeah.
very much so. I think we're at the beginning of something a little dark, which has to do with nationalism and with willful ignorance. And I think we saw that during the 2 years of the pandemic. Ignoring facts, ignoring science, ignoring common sense, if you so want, for sometimes not entirely clear reasons. There is a lot of resentment around. It's not that easy to pinpoint what it is. In my feeling, it has to do with this: I don't have what I should have, with the haves and the have-nots. Even in very wealthy societies, we have disenfranchised people, quite a lot of them, that are unhappy about the current world order, about globalization, actually. It's an anti-movement. It's a going back to the border, the keeping out things, the not engaging with education. So even if we have YouTube and the ability to learn so much, people are not really taking advantage of this. Some are, but it's not that technology just changes the human and now we get enlightened through it. Unfortunately, there was a belief that would happen, in the early times of the internet. Did not happen. Yeah. So in Europe, I actually think yes, and in other parts of the world, Latin America also has a tendency for, authoritarian or more authoritarian regimes. And I'm not saying this is going to be, there for 100 years, but yes. So that is definitely what I see happening.
Parag, what about you?
Well, this is another area where I think there's unevenness. The COVID pandemic has really exposed the lack of state capacity in so many countries that were, in any case, quite borderline in terms of the health of their economies and societies and their political fragility. So we can't possibly describe those countries as characterizing a resurgence of the state. And that's dozens and dozens and dozens of countries. So it's hardly a trivial matter. There has been, or had been prior to COVID, a set of countries, particularly in Asia, where state capacity was genuinely rising. And this is not a subjective matter. This is the way it's measured by the worldwide governance indicators of the World Bank. Effectiveness of the delivery of public services, the ability of the government to raise taxes, expenditure on infrastructure and healthcare, these kinds of things. So we have very tangible measurements of state capacity. And in those places, you can say the state was getting stronger, and the state has proven resilient during COVID as a result of that built up, capacity. And I think that it's always a continuum in terms of the strength of the state. Now, your question is also at the nation state, which relates to identity. Yeah. Now, most of the places in the world that we have traditionally thought of as nation states are technically no longer nation states because they're no longer in anything, they no longer represent anything like the degree of ethnic homogeneity that is inherent in that very term. So we really shouldn't be using the term. That itself is a sign of how much has changed. So there's a difference between the sort of, return of the state, which is potentially temporary, potentially permanent, depends on which states or governments are really stepping up. And then there's the questions of the overlapping identity of the people and the government, within the state. And there, a lot of times in geopolitics today, we talk about the civilizational states. such as Russia or Turkey or India, China, places where we talk about strong men, rulers, flexing their muscles and using national identity as part of the pillar or platform, of their nationalism. But I would be very, very cautious. I think that was a short-term theme, a meme, but really more of a blip, which is not to say that China is not genuinely animated geopolitically and otherwise by a certain sense of nationalism, but China happens to also be a nation state. Mm-hmm. But one of the interesting things that you notice when you look at Russia and you look at Turkey and you look at India, these other countries that we've identified as being part of this resurgence of the civilizational state actually relates to demographics and migration. Because these same countries are the places where young people are running for the exits. Now, it seems to me that if you want to paint a society as being nationalistic, surely you might look a bit closely at the psychology of the people and whether or not they genuinely believe in the same rallying cries as their leaders. It turns out that the people have no interest in that nationalism whatsoever and would much rather leave the country. So it's a much more hollow, truly hollow nationalism than what many political scientists impute or project onto these countries, seen from the bottom up and from the inside out, as I try to depict it. So I see really a mixed bag there. And let's also remember, if we were to conflate nationalism and populism, as so many people have done, populism's implosion in just the last several years in the United States, in Britain, in other countries, in Italy, in Germany, and elsewhere, speaks really for itself. So it really is a reminder that we should absolutely not fall into the trap of extrapolating or universalizing from Trump or Brexit and believing that the whole world is being swept up in a nationalist wave, because nothing of the sort is happening. And the very regimes today that are run by populists are the last place that anyone wants to be and the last role models that anyone would bother to emulate.
Fair point. I think it's a good reminder. Those two words beginning with an N and a P are quite different, and to be part of a nation versus being populist. So we've talked quite a bit and in the press a lot about democracy, the end of democracy, the fall, the questioning of democracy. When we're looking at the challenges which we collectively can see, especially with climate change, with water shortages, et cetera, with the migration, which you documented quite well, do you believe democracy fit for purpose for the challenges which we will be facing in cybersecurity and politics? Is it capable?
So democracy can be seen as, a way of ordering society and power, etc., but it also has to do with values. It has to do with justice and equality, that you actually don't have too many power imbalances. And there's a ton of different types of democracies in the world, how it's actually regulated. So the idea is fit for the future. And I think it's the only way as humans we can get towards a, juster world through democracy, because it is about making sure you distribute power. Are we there yet? No, not at all. In many parts of the world, not everywhere, but in many parts, democracy is under threat because it threatens certain people that are in power. And even though I agree with Parag about, nationalism, populism, etc., but the state still has, whatever you want, what kind of adjective you want to add to the state, is, tools of violence. And I think we should therefore not, even if it's true that people might not want to be there, they have more ability than, other political bodies, because they have, police, military, etc., etc. So that is why there is a certain danger there when democracy becomes also questioned as something that is not really what we want because it's too slow, etc., etc. For me, that is a dangerous tendency that we have, again, in Europe. at least. I see a lot of those debates, about the good way of governing the people, and there's too many dumb people, so they cannot be in a democratic system, etc., etc.
That's a really, really, really good point, important point, I think, to remember the ideal and where to go for versus some of the manifestation, and not to give up on the fighting for that representation and balance. Parag, what about you? How do you I don't hear you right now.
I have been struck by the surveys over the last 10 years that point to the growing disillusionment with dissatisfaction with the state of democracy in the Western world. It's at this point a fairly universal, quite an ironclad and damning phenomenon and story. And I think obviously the underperformance of welfare states to sustain themselves and their benefits and deliver the good life, and inability to cope with the complexities of an interconnected world economy and international competition, and to remain innovative and to maintain education levels at the standards that are necessary and the skill sets needed, and to provide higher wages and that kind of stability and support. It's all too much for welfare states that are already so fiscally stressed with high dependency ratios and entitlements and so forth. So I'm not, it's a shame that, the challenges have been so severe that perhaps it's not a surprise that states have struggled to maintain that high standard of social protection and welfare and, again, preparedness. And therefore, it's not a surprise that young people are as disillusioned as they are. But I don't want to therefore chalk it up to a quote unquote failure of democracy. Not all democracies have failed. So if you make a theoretical point that it's a failure of democracy, then it would need to be more universal than it is, but it's not. So it's a failure of particular systems, but not necessarily democracy per se, because Canada hasn't failed, right? Germany hasn't failed. There's problems in Germany, but Germany has not failed. So there's Japan has not failed. There are leading democratic states in the world that are constantly adapting and staying ahead of the curve as best they can, even if things aren't as easy as the good old days. So I want to actually posit instead that we're just in an era of intensifying institutional competition. And in a way, we're always in a period of institutional competition. Models that are you could say, put it in Darwinian terms, that are competing to adapt to the times. And the question becomes, if we live in a hyper-complex, interdependent, fast-moving world, what is the form of government that is most suited to those circumstances and is going to do the best job of governing its society and providing the fundamental benefits and opportunities that people expect? And the answer is not going to be simply, quote unquote, democracy. That's not good enough an answer, right? It has to be coupled with a diagnosis and a prescription for what kinds of institutions. In my work, I focus on the role of civil services, and I look at countries that have a strong and effective civil service and their ability to shape policy and adapt and recommend certain spending and changes in capital expenditure and so forth that help to cope. And so to me, that it's not really about democracy versus authoritarianism, which is so often the way this debate is characterized. It's really about the caliber of governance, and you have many hybrid kinds of regimes. Again, I live in one here in Singapore. There's the UAE, many successful models around the world that are not absolutely here nor absolutely there. And that's the operative question is not, are you a democracy or non-democracy? And young people seem to care less and less anyway. The question is, are you effective under these circumstances or not?
I think that's a perfect place to pause, which is the question, as you've said, as we're moving into this time of incredible volatility around the world and many, many, many stresses upon all of our systems. Now, what are those governance structures? What are those infrastructures which will allow us to thrive collectively because we live on one planet and we have to survive and thrive together. And I think this is I think the major takeaway for me as we're moving into the thinking about this new medieval, where there were many towers, many walls built and destroyed. How can we thrive in this evolving landscape? And with that, unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our time together. So Parag and Myriam, once again, the hour has just slipped by in a heartbeat. Parag, thank you for joining us from Singapore. Truly a delight. And again, your new book, go out and get it, everyone. Sounds really great. I'm going to look forward to perusing it again. Myriam, it's always a delight to have you in the studio. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
So thanks to both of you. And thank you for those who have joined us. There are a few questions that came in I couldn't get to. I apologize for that. I just couldn't figure out how to slip them in. But we're going to take note of them and see what we can do for next time. And our next time is actually the 24th of February with MIT Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, Daniela Roos. I look forward to seeing all of you there then. Thank you. Have a great day. Stay safe. Drink lots of water and eat an apple.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Parag. Thanks, Myriam.